I was quite a little bit unsure about which angle to go with this talk, because there's an awful lot of Ichneumon wasps, and there's so many things you can talk about. So I guess the approach I've taken is to sort of look mainly at the morphology of these things and see how it relates to what they're doing out there. So I hope it's kind of vaguely interesting. But here's some of the friendly faces. If you get to know Ichneumonids, if you've got a nice collection of Ichneumonids, these are some of the faces that could be staring at you down the microscope. All these, they're gorgeous, all of them. So we'll meet some of these lovely things as we go through. But basically, I suppose the message really is all these faces are sort of really portraying various adaptations to getting out of cocoons, out of wood, out of pupae, or for chewing their way into cocoons or wood or pupae. There's a lot you can tell from the face of a wasp. Okay, but just to clear up a few things to begin with, what am I actually talking about when I say icks? It's a bit interchangeable. Ichneumonids or ichneumanoids. Ichneumanoidea is the superfamily, so that's Braconidae plus Ichneumonidae classically. But recently there's been a third family described, this weird Australian subfamily called the Trachypetainae, and now the Trachypetidae, which were judged to be the sister group to the Braconids. So it's always a bit of a subjective matter as to whether a sister group is, as to whether they're a subfamily or family, but they are weird. So we'll briefly introduce the Trachypetids just for completeness. Trachypetids, just a few species in Australia, only known in Australia. They're massive compared to most Braconids. Really, they're ex-Braconids, aren't they? Really interesting big things. They've got weird adaptations, like a strange pit on the mandible, but nobody's ever reared one. We don't know what they're doing. Some are incredibly rare and likely extinct. And we're lucky enough to have specimens of all three genera in the Natural History Museum, but not all in great condition, as you can see from the photos there. Anyway, let's just briefly introduce you to the Trachypetids, which won't feature again. Braconids, I'm just showing you some host remains here. Braconids are really conspicuous sometimes in that they attack a lot of caterpillars, a lot of aphids, so we tend to notice them. They also, on this particular slide, we have a fairy. I have to have a sort of Arctiacaria. I think that was a garden tiger mummy, the hairy one. If not, maybe it's a fox moth. But it's been mummified by Aliodes alternator, which is one of those wasps that got me into parasitoids. I found these on Hilbury Island. There were loads of garden tigers at the time. Some of them were mummified like this, and then these amazing little orange and black wasps popped out from those emergence holes. We've also got a mummy, a rather wrinkly looking mummy of a hawk moth, which has been attacked by another Aliodes. And we've got a mummified aphid with a pupa beneath it, well, the cocoon of the wasp beneath it. So these are some of the, but we're gonna, because I do like Braconids and I also do a bit of work on them, but we're really gonna skip over Braconids and concentrate on Ichneumonids because we can't talk all night, but I will come back to Braconids right at the end of the talk. But just to point out, although there's a lot fewer than Ichneumonids, it's a really big family. In Britain and Ireland, you've got 1,340 species and 28 subfamilies. Great diversity of Braconids and a lovely group to get into. This is really about Ichneumonids, the third and largest family of the Ichneumanoidea. So, you know, as everybody knows, there's loads of Ichneumonids out there, and but it is quite, there's about 2,500 species that we know of in Britain, and nowadays classified in 35 subfamilies, so lots to get your teeth into. I suppose they do historically have a reputation for being really difficult to get into, and that's why I called it icky icks. Also, the biology of these things may be considered quite icky as well, I guess. But they are a tricky group. There's no denying it because there are so many species, and the subfamilies, if you use most of the existing keys to Ichneumonids, it can be really difficult to get it down to the sort of subfamilies and then to genera. Obviously, I should plug my book. If you can see that there, published a book a couple of years ago. It's an introduction. It's tried to make it a bit easier. One of my projects is to get these pictures into a much more accessible format, into a website, and where people can really browse, hopefully get a better feel for the way that each subfamily looks, and then keep an updated guide to all the literature. So I'll be looking at, so as we go through, I'll look at some characters, some bits of bodies of Ichneumon wasps, and try and relate that to how they're useful as identification features and useful for biology. But here's just some pictures. I love the picture of the Lysinota there, with its long, quite long ovipositor probing into a grass head, and that's going for Mesopomea larva, one of the common rustics. And what they do is often they'll find really early instar larvae before they drop down to the ground. They're much more accessible, so that's quite cool. You can see these things quite commonly in the summer. And then you've got an Amblyopod, which has come out of a hawk moth pupa. Both of those endoparasitoids, so they live inside the host. And then you've got a slightly fuzzier photo is an Otoblastus, which is a triphonine, and that's laying its egg on the cuticle of the caterpillar, directly behind of the sawfly larva, directly behind its head. So that's an ectoparasitoid. It will complete its development outside the host. Just in case you're, if you want to look at some differences between Ichneumonids and Braconids, they're really quite similar looking families, but almost always instantly separable on the wing venation. So if you want to go into details, they've got Ichneumonids on the left, it's my left anyway, have this big disco submarginal cell, and that is the sort of horse head cell, as I like to call it. Braconids typically have a cross vein, so they have a separate discal cell and submarginal cell. Ichneumonids almost always have this cross vein 2 MCU, whereas Braconids don't have it. And then there's some kind of neat differences in the hind wing venation, which is basically to do with where veins are joining. Basically, the almost always readily separable on the wing venation, except of course there's always these complications. So you get weird little tiny aphid parasitoids like Aphidius, which have a wing venation which looks like an Ichneumon. And then you've got strange Ichneumonids like Hybizon and Neoracodes, where the sort of wing venation is all squashed up, so they just look odd. And the Clastus down there, just to demonstrate that some Ichneumonids have a very weak or absent vein 2 MCU. Just things, some pitfalls there, but basically pretty easy to separate. I'm sure I've shown charts like this before, but I'm always surprised when I look at just how many parasitoids there are in Britain. So parasitoid wasps. So all these Ichneumonids and Braconids are, as far as we know, acting as parasitoids. That's developing in or on other insects or spiders. There's a few other exceptions. There's one little Ichneumon which has been reared from pseudoscorpion egg sacs, which is quite weird. And is there anything else? No. Outside of Britain, there's a few phytophagous Ichneumonids and Braconids. Particularly, there's quite a few gall-forming Braconids in the tropics. Not in Britain, as far as we know. But there you go. 85% of our Hymanoptera are parasitoid wasps. So it's a big order, 7,700 species, and a lot of them are parasitoids. And of those, so almost exactly half of UK Hymanoptera are Ichneumonids, these two families, Ichneumonids and Braconids. And I just did a little calculation. There's 16% of British and Irish insects are Ichneumon wasps. So why doesn't everyone look at them? There's loads to get into. But now these aren't Ichneumonids, these are Chalcidoids. This is the other big diverse superfamily of parasitoid wasps, the Chalcidoidea. And I just wanted to put this slide in from a fairly recent paper, just to show, I mean, chalcids are really diverse. Their morphology seems to be a lot more plastic than Ichneumonids. They come in all shapes and sizes, quite amazing. They're little, a lot of these things are just beautiful little jewels when you look at them down the microscope. And that's a whole other discipline, really, Chalcidoid wasps. Whereas there seem to, at least in north temperate areas, there are a lot more Ichneumonids than there are chalcids, but they're much more homogeneous. I mean, there's a fair amount of variation here in these subfamilies of Ichneumonids, but basically, I mean, compared to the chalcids, there's they're more subtle. So this is one of the reasons why it's been quite difficult historically to recognize subfamilies, because the differences, when you're used to them, the differences are quite can be pretty tangible, and but in terms of key characters, they can be quite tricky. So yeah, there's a few different shapes and sizes relating to, well, we'll come on to why they're particular shapes and sizes. But this is really just a slide showing some of the different ways in which Ichimonid wasps are accessing their hosts. They're either sticking their ovipositor through a substrate or directly contacting their host. And this sort of way that they hold themselves is the key, and the challenge they have in accessing their host is the key to some of their some of these differences in their body shapes. And we got two sort of we've got some fairly long ovipositors over there going into a sort of thistle head and into a solitary wasp nest. Totally unrelated families, but subfamilies, but sort of converged and similar morphology. You've got a cryptine going into a burner moth pupa. Often you can rear these Listerinathus really commonly. They can attack a high proportion of 6 and 5 spot burnets. You've got Natalia vinuli attacking the pus moth. Really quite a well-known species for that habit. It's laying its shiny black eggs firmly anchored into the skin of its host there. And you've got an Agrippon stealthily sort of sticking its abdomen underneath its body and jabbing at the caterpillar. All really cool things. Yeah, I mean, but so some of these morphologies are totally convergent, and also some of the main sort of life history, some of these really quite different life history traits have converged, have evolved separately. So we have a sort of sketchy evolutionary tree. So this is a sort of consensus phylogeny. It's a sort of best bet on how Ichneumoniid subfamilies are related. It's not the details are really not particularly interesting, but you've got sort of 3 major groupings of Ichneumonids: the sort of Ichneumoniformes, the Pimpliformes, and the Ophioniformes. And these particular larvae here on their host caterpillars and spider, these are developing as coenobiont ectoparasitoids. And what that is the egg has been laid on the outside of the host, and then the wasp larvae develop entirely externally. So usually this means the host is temporarily paralyzed, the egg is laid, and then it recovers and it goes about its business. And in the case of the caterpillars and the sawflies, when they go to spin their cocoons, that's when the Ichimonid larva really starts feeding voraciously and kills it off. In the case of the spider, it's more obviously, sometimes they do modify the spider web, these wasps, so that the spider then spins a different sort of web for the wasp to spin, to pupate in more safely. But the point is, these larvae are doing fairly similar things on the outside of their hosts, but this sort of strategy evolved in 3 totally different groups of wasps. You've got Triphonine up there, developing on a little, is it a tortricid larva, I think? And then you've got an Adelignathus, a little tiny subfamily called Adelignathini, developing on a 10th Verdinid sawfly. This is a species Mark Shaw described recently from his garden in Edinburgh. Quite cool. You can do that with Ichneumonids. You can just find new species in your gardens. It's a shame, really, because I'd like to do more exotic field work, but never mind. And then the spider, it has a pimpline on it, one of the Polysphincter group. So there you go. And we can look at really conspicuous sort of long ovipositors. I'll come on to ovipositors a bit later, because ovipositors are really the key to wasp success. But these are 4 different subfamilies, all with long ovipositors, and again, totally unrelated groups. And basically, these are all groups that have evolved to find their hosts quite deeply concealed. It used to be that pretty much anything that was sort of a bit chunky with a long ovipositor was called a pimpline. But nowadays, these have been split up into loads of different groups because it's recognized that this is a very convergent morphology. an so just another biological trait, the sort of opposite of that ectoparasitism is endoparasitism, of course, where an egg is laid inside the host. And again, it can go either way. Sometimes the host is paralyzed and the wasp larva just sort of typically eats it'll be a pupa and eats it just as a bag of fresh meat from the inside. But more commonly, they'll be laying their eggs into an active host, typically a caterpillar or sawfly larva, and then waiting again for that host to either find a pupation retreat or to spin its cocoon. And at that point, again, they sort of rapidly eat the host from the inside. An interesting difference, these are two totally unrelated groups. Again, we've got an Ichneumon, that's Listrodromus, which attacks the holly blue. Very well-known parasitoid. It seems to cause quite marked population crashes in its host. And then you've got a Campoplegine, a Hypersota species. And this one is again, this is an endoparasitoid laying its egg into the caterpillar, as with the Listrodromus. But the Listrodromus waits until the caterpillar is pupated before killing it. The Campoplegine is impatient, so it doesn't wait. And instead, what it does is it kills the host caterpillar when it's still exposed. And in this case, it's spun. This is one of few species which spins its own cocoon inside the hollowed out skin of its host caterpillar. And you can see the wasp cocoon has this black and white mottling on it. It's presumably to disguise itself as bird poo. But yeah, if you're going to kill your host in an exposed situation, you have to have a really good cocoon. So there's some really lovely sort of disguise mimicry strategies going on in Campoplegine cocoons. Another trait you might have seen, I gave a webinar for Teneptra Trust on nocturnal wasps recently. It's one of my favorite groups. I like these nocturnal things because I'm a light trapper at heart. But they're also a nice challenge because they all tend to look the same. So here's three totally different subfamilies. We've got Ophionine, we've got a Mesocorine and a Triphonine, and they've all converged on the same sort of appearance because they fly at night. They basically don't need any extravagant patterns. They probably don't need any much melanin in their cuticle. So what you're seeing is just a raw sort of yellowy, browny, orange color. And so yeah, they fly at night, they attack caterpillars, or in the case of Mesocorus, they attack other Ichneumon wasps inside caterpillars. And they have long antennae, big eyes. The one with the slight yellow stripes on it is a Natilia species, which is undescribed. I think I've only seen 2 specimens of that from Yorkshire and Lancashire. So it's one to look out for. It's going to be named after Pete Chandler. Peter Chandler collected one of the 2 specimens. Peter Chandler has collected so many interesting specimens. But Natilia, I mean, I think I may have said that already a few weeks ago, but I mean, Natilia is a lovely genus with about 25 species in Britain, and about 5 of those seem to be undescribed. So all these things that sort of look pretty similar, there's a lot of diversity going on, which, and in some groups, just nobody's ever looked at them properly. So again, really useful taxonomy that I can do without going too far from home. So yeah, those are some examples of sort of real convergences, but there's also groups of Ichimonids which have totally different biology. There's only one genus of Ichimonids that climbs into the water and then searches for caddis pupae on the bottom, and that's Agriotipus. It's a genus which has quite a few species, well, not quite a few, has a few species in Southeast Asia, and then there's one species, Agriotipus armatus, which goes right across the Palearctic and is in Britain. And in fact, it should be out now. I guess Ian Wallace should have some great advice about how to find these things. But it attacks, it attacks Silo, and I think it attacks Gera, I never know how to pronounce it, and maybe some others. But it's a weird and wonderful little wasp, little Ichneumon, and it has this sort of banded wings and a very sort of tubular Mesozoma, which I'll come on to in a minute. And you might find these caddis pupae with this long sort of basically breathing tube coming out the one end. So what the Agriotipus does obviously it paralyzes the caddis, lays an egg on it, and its larva consumes the caddis and then starts extruding all this silk, which it sort of kicks the silk back, but weaves quite a dense sort of tube of it, which it then sort of shoves out the end of the case, and this acts as a sort of large surface area for gas exchange, so it can continue to breathe while it's pupating over the winter, while it's remaining as a pupa over the winter. Like I say, they're out now when the streams are starting to warm up slightly. Agriotipus have a big spine on this and on their thorax, which presumably is something to do with them getting out of this case under the water, but nobody's ever really observed what they're doing with that spine. So Agritipus takes us on actually to a really useful feature of ichneumonids in general. As you can see, the Agriotipus abdomen there is really like well sclerotized. It's a big hard abdomen. Basically, the underside is as well sclerotized as the upper side. But most ichneumonids are more like the other picture, which is a megastylus that's north of centrine. And what they have is the underside of the abdomen, or the Mesozoma, is quite membranous. They have these sort of lateral tergites which hang off, or sometimes are folded under, and then they have this sort of membranous area which is more or less sclerotized in patches. It's just a weird feature of ichneumonids. Almost all Hymanoptera have well sclerotized underside of the abdomen. Yeah, another weird and wonderful wasp, Euceros. So Euceros is a weird little genus with a few species scattered around most of the world. Anywhere in the world, you've got a good chance of finding a Euceratine, but not many species of them. And in Britain, we have 3 species. Some weird features, like males have these really expanded antennal segments. Some of them are quite colourful. They've got a pronotal flange, that slightly obscure picture on the top right for me, with a blue line. It shows this little sort of bilobed process on behind the head. No idea what that's for. And then the female with its really flimsy ovipositor. That's quite a distinctive feature. The ovipositor is really weak and basically barely held together. And that's because of its weird biology, which is laying eggs. It doesn't lay its eggs on or in other hosts, just glues them onto the substrate, onto leaves or branches. This is from a lovely paper by Mark Shaw in Edinburgh, who got these things in culture. He got a female Euceros alive, and he observed her laying a lot of eggs. They in fact lay hundreds of eggs, because this is a high risk strategy that they have. In fact, everything about its biology is really high risk. It's amazing that they still exist. So they lay these eggs on these little stalks. The larva hatches out and sits there on the egg. That's in picture 2. And these are planidial larvae. Well, planidium technically is a wandering larva, whereas these don't actually do much wandering. They sit there on their little platform, but they wait for a caterpillar or a sawfly to wander past, and basically they then hitch a ride. So number 3 and 4, that shows this tiny little planidium, this little first instar larva of Euceros, sitting in the little fold between 2 segments of a caterpillar. And it just sits there. And then after a while, I think when the caterpillar is about to pupate, it burrows in and sits inside the body of the host, and then hopes to find an ichneumon or braconid larva inside. If it finds this ichneumon larva, it then successfully parasitizes it. So that's picture 4. That's just behind the head of an ichneumon larva, and there's the Euceros inside, and then eats it. Then later on it pops out and finishes eating it from the outside, and there's a pupa, which is number 5. Well, that's the Euceros pre-pupa. But there's obviously a really high chance they're going to miss. There's a high chance they will never find any caterpillar. There's a high chance that caterpillar is not going to be parasitized. And then what happens is
So in that latter chance, apparently you can find them sometimes in the adult moth. Basically, this little tiny planidial larva, a Euceros, just doomed, just sitting inside this moth. Yeah, weird lifestyle. Yeah, to go back to morphology, as you you'll be aware that a lot of Hymenoptera are kind of weird. The Apocrypha and Hymanoptera are strange in that the first abdominal segment is fused to the thorax, and then so what looks like the abdomen is the second segment of the abdomen onwards. So you've got obviously head, thorax, propodium, and we call that first abdominal segment the propodium, and then you've got the rest of the abdomen, which we call the Mesozoma. Yeah, this is all basically, I'm utilizing a lot of pictures from the handbook because in this case, because Dawn Reader did some absolutely lovely photos, lovely line drawings, and it'd be a shame not to show them more widely. But this just shows the sort of different tergites of the abdomen, different segments, and then you've got the ovipositor and the ovipositor sheaths at the back, which originate from different segments. They're sort of ancestrally little appendages which have been modified into this really extravagant egg-laying organ and sting. It's a multifunctional tool, which we'll come on to later. But we're going to have a little sort of journey through the body of the wasp. I wanted to start, so at the tip, we've got the antennae. Antennae in Ichneumonids are mostly simple, sort of multi-segmented things, typically 16 segments or more. In some of the nocturnal Ichneumonids, you can get up to about 70 antennal segments, and it becomes really hard to count all those segments without blinking. I do that sometimes. On this, you've got interesting features for identifying Ichneumonids on these antennae. You've got tyloids, little weird structures, which are often to do with releasing chemicals, but sometimes they're some of these tyloids, you may see little sort of hard-looking, slightly incurved areas on male antennae, and those are basically to help the antenna coil. So when they pump fluid in at that point, that's a hard point. So the sort of antenna sort of bends around it, and they can coil their antennae in that way around the female's antenna in their courtship, which is very cute. Some other interesting quirks of Ichimonid antennae. Some of them have hammers. We've got a little montage of 4 hammer tips at the ends of the antennae, and then an Zorides, which has these little projections a bit further back from the tip. I did some work on these years ago, and this is just solid cuticle. These are just for bashing substrate, and they hear the echoes of their hosts. So they bash on wood or solid or big cocoons, and they can hear whether there's a gap inside or whether it's solid, and then make an inference as to whether there's a host. And then you've got some features where I just don't know what they are. This is the close-up of SEM of the antenna there. It just shows a little aggregation of sensilla, which is characteristic of this tribe. Don't know what they're doing, but there's all sorts of weird sense organs on the antennae of Ichneumonids, as there are for many other insects. Mandibles are really essential, obviously, for chewing your way out of a host or chewing your way into a host. We've got a trogus on the left there, Trogus lapidator from a swallowtail pupa. Every lepidopterist's worst nightmare, but obviously some of us, that's the tipping point when you realize that the wasp coming out is a bit more interesting than the moth that would have been. And what's that trogus has softened the cuticle. They produce this weird sort of salivary substance which softens the cuticle, and then they sort of just shove their way out. But many wasps have a harder time of it and have specialized mandibles for chewing through wood, or you got a tridentate mandible there. That's these 3 teeth are used to chew strips off a hoverfly puparium. Very specialized little tool to get out of. Yeah, a lot of parasitoid wasps that attack hoverflies have, or Diptera generally, have quite specialized mandibles for getting out. It seems to be something to do with the puparium is quite
it's quite a challenge. Here's some lovely heads. Again, these are, sometimes they can be very useful for identification. You've got a lovely fairy face of a stillbops, together with its sort of slightly weird back of the head with this elongated jowls, basically. Stillbops are attacking longhorn moths. You've got the lovely little moustache of a Triphonine. This is a very good bristly moustache there. Triphonines always have that. We don't know, again, we don't really know why. You've got a big mandible with a big lower tooth of a Ctenopelmatine, which are attacking sawfly cocoons. You've got a sort of rather rounded head of a Stenomacrus, an orthocentrine, which is pushing its way out of, or pushing its way into a fungus to attack fungus gnats. So again, these things, and then you've got an Ideogramma, which have these big, long mandibles and a very wide head, because they're pulling apart the bracts in pine cones to attack Xyella sawflies that are inside. Yeah, some weird and wonderful head of an this is a view from beneath of an Allomaya. Allomaya comprises 2 species in Britain which attack Hepialids. So which one is it? Orange swift and common swift is presumed, although one of them's not been reared actually. But to do this, they have to go into into the sort of underground retreat of the swift moth, the swift caterpillars, and they for whatever reason they seem to have a very armored head, probably because the caterpillars are quite dangerous actually. They are known to bite off the antennae of these things. They've got these great big shovel-like mandibles. It's probably quite risky business going tackling Hepialid larva in its burrow. And then you've got Pseudorissa, just to demonstrate that you've got, if you're identifying Ichneumonids, quite often there's a key character, which is whether it's got an occipital carina, which is the little, often a very difficult to distinguish ridge at the back of the head, and whether that is dipped or absent centrally. So yeah, that's what you're looking for anyway. The occipital carina, which basically separates 2 ancestral segments which have made up the head. Again, very good key characters. If you're identifying Ichneumonids, you'll get questions about whether it has notauli or notauli. A notaulus is a groove on the top. This is the mesoscutum, it's the middle of the thorax. So looking down, you've got these big grooves of the notauli. Sometimes there's no notaulus at all. A couple of genera in Britain, 3 genera I think, have these conspicuous ridges going across, and that across the mesoscutum, and that's because they're pupating inside wood, and when they're having to chew their way out, they basically sort of brace themselves against the tunnel, so and that acts as a good sort of good grip. Again, I'm just dashing through bits of the body here, but the Mesozoma, oh god, I'm really going to run out of time, so I should just speed up. The Mesozoma, which is the thorax plus propodium, this is just an example here. I like the Brachycertus and the Dichrogasta there, very distantly related groups, but they have almost exactly the same shape because they're both attacking chrysopids, green lacewings. They're in these rather rounded cocoons of, they've got a pupate inside the rather rounded cocoon of a lacewing. So that's sort of lovely. You can imagine the abdomen curled under them. They make a lovely little ball. Legs, sometimes you've got Trochantellus, which is usually got a Trochantellus, and then this little arrow points to a group where that's missing. That's Metopines. Sometimes Ichneumonids have this lovely fringe of setae. Sometimes they have a tooth in the hind femurs, and the legs can be quite compact. So lovely little characters in the legs, but we're going to scoot past that. Really interesting is at the end of the leg, the claws, where you have various groups which have pectinate claws, these big teeth on the claws like a comb, which presumably is for gripping onto caterpillars or sometimes sawflies. You have other groups which have lobe, and then the 2 legs here are a spider parasitoid, and they have a big sort of aurolium as well. Basically, they have quite a modified
quite a modified tarsus because they're walking around on a spider web. The Propodium has all sorts of different shapes and sizes and different groups of Ichneumonids. Really worth looking at Propodiums, how they have these ridges, the corinae. Sometimes they have regular patterns, sometimes it's a honeycomb pattern, sometimes they're lacking corinae. This is all to do with muscle attachments, basically inside. It's to do with them manipulating their abdomen. But the Propodium basically is full of really good identification features. And then you get down to what makes wasps special, really, which is the way they lay eggs. And this is first manifested, I guess, at the anterior end of the abdomen, the first of the mesozoma. The first mesosomal segment can be really long and skinny in groups that are sort of bending their abdomen far underneath them, or they can be short and stout if they're not having to do that bending. So there's some of the variety of first metasomal segments in Ichneumonids. Really good, really useful for identifying subfamilies. And this is why they have these different shapes. You can see in Agrippon, lovely leggy sort of Ichneumonids. They've got long legs, and those long back legs are again, they're bracing themselves. As in this case, you can see she puts her abdomen underneath her with the ovipositor sticking forward, and then lunges, bracing herself with the back legs. Ovipositor quickly delivers an egg into the caterpillar. Whereas this Glypta is doing something very differently. It's very different. It just raises its abdomen with its not quite so enlarged back legs, and then it has enough room to get that ovipositor underneath it and probe inside that substrate. So the abdomen does not go under it. It's got a rather stout metazoma instead. So even if you don't know the biology of a particular species, you can often make a good guess from features like this as to what it looks like. Again, just this is different views from above of these different first metasomal segments. Short and stout, skinny, petiolate, tubular. There's all sorts of shapes and sizes. The metasoma itself has loads of really interesting features on it to do with whether it has lots of punctures or whether it has grooves, whether it has these there's an arrow pointing to a thyridium. Again, we're not really sure what thyridia do, but they're there on some groups of Ichneumonids, presumably something to do with, well, there's different theories actually, whether it's something to do with sensing chemicals or whether it's actually an auditory organ. It'd be quite interesting to know. Need to do some work with their transmission SEMs, I think. Ovipositors, this is what it's all about. This is the key to the success of Hymanoptera generally. It's this ovipositor which has evolved into a sting. It's evolved into they've evolved into drills, into needles. We've got two of my favorites here. We've got Clistopyga at the top with its upcurved ovipositor, and we've got Proclitus. The Proclitus is using that long ovipositor to reach inside, to probe inside a fungus. This is the underside of a sep, is it? I don't know. It's going for a fungus gnat, and you can just about see on the photo, hopefully, it's got a tiny little notch because it's on its ovipositor, because it's ovipositing into an active larva. And the little notch holds the skin of the larva in place while it lays its egg. The Clistopyga is going for spider egg sacs, and in some ways it's a unspecialized predator. It's just laying its egg inside the spider egg sac, and then its young will eat the eggs. But the ovipositor tip itself has these tiny little hooks on it, which acts like a felting needle, as my colleague showed a few years ago. It can sort of pull back and then rearrange the silk so as to hide its hole that it made when it shoved its ovipositor in, probably to protect itself from other parasites and predators. Here's some other weird and wonderful ovipositors. You have teeth, you have a notch. You've got tiny ovipositors when they're attacking something that's right there accessible to them. You have a big long ovipositor for drilling through wood. This is one of my favorite specimens from the museum. This is a rissa. It obviously, it presumably got eaten by a bird whilst it was midway through drilling
and this is now stuck through solid wood. It's an amazing act watching these things drill. Yeah, and just to say, like I mentioned earlier, obviously I am really lucky. I've gone to some really exciting places looking at Ichneumon wasps, but I've also done over the years just been able to find really cool stuff going on in my garden. I wanted, at the top there's Orionis coxator. That's a braconid, coming back to braconids. This little wasp was a mysterious specimen I had at my my light sheet in my garden in the first lockdown last year, and I couldn't identify it for ages. And I eventually worked out, and with the help of DNA sequences as well, it's a thing described from the far east of Russia, from Primorsky. I have no idea what it's doing in my garden in Kent. So that's an interesting thing. But it also caused me to look at a few other species, and we're actually got with a colleague a paper out reclassifying some of these things. But yeah, you can, things like this, it could well have been here all along. You just don't know with parasitoids, or it could have been introduced from a garden centre recently. We've a lot to find out. Ophion slavisecki I reared years ago from heart and dart larvae in my old garden. I was very excited about it. This is just to show that there's a really rubbish camera phone picture, but this is the Ophion larva emerged from the heart and dart caterpillar and started spinning this lovely white silk cocoon, and I was delighted because this is a really common species of Ichneumon. We didn't know what the host was, and then later on it finishes the job by making a hard black cocoon or dark brown cocoon, and it has to dig its way out of the soil quite often, which is why the mandibles can be abraded, showing 3 different stages of mandible abrasion down the left. But anyway, it turned out at the same time 2 other people had reared it, so we collaborated. But still, I was chuffed that I found out its host in my own garden. And we've got a couple of Ichneumonids searching on my old log pile that I used to have at the side of the house. I'll just quickly show this video. This is Podeshistus. Hopefully this works for you. Do somebody shout if it's not working. I think I was the first person to notice this Podeshistus. It's searching for presumably a beetle inside the wood, and the tips of the antennae are moving really energetically. And yeah, I don't think anybody else had ever noticed this before. You can see it's like 2 little wiggly worms feeling very carefully for little cracks in the wood. And in fact, how it does that, because obviously there's no muscles in that antenna, this is all through hydrostatic pressure. And then it finds a little tiny gap, tiny crack which I hadn't seen, then has a go at shoving its ovipositor in. So you see the antennae leading the ovipositor tip to the crack in the wood. This is all very exciting for me. The video goes on a bit long, actually. It doesn't do anything very exciting. It doesn't find its host, unfortunately. I took this log apart later and didn't find any parasitized larvae. Yeah, but just to end with Braconids again, do look up on YouTube this lovely video. I'll have to send you all the link to it. Actually, I forgot to put it in. I should have put it in the chat. There's a guy I was working with a filmmaker. Well, I was advising this filmmaker, James Dunbar, who did this beautiful film of the Cotesia glomerata, which is the cabbage, which attacks cabbage white, particularly large white butterflies. So these stills from it don't do it justice, really, but he caught all these aspects of its behavior. And this is a species I got into observing a few years ago because they were eating because I had large whites eating my cabbage. And then towards the end of the year, a good proportion of them are parasitized by Cotesia glomerata. So you can watch it, you can watch them attacking the host, you can watch the larvae emerging. It's really gruesome. But there's all sorts of really cool stuff going on here. Obviously, the caterpillar's attacking the wasp, it's not defenseless. But just later on, you've got the larvae bursting out of the caterpillar when they finish. The caterpillar goes quiet because it's 2 reasons, really, which have been found relatively recently. The larvae, this just to show you some of the complexity involved and some of the things, we don't know this level of detail for most species of parasitoid wasps. We only know this one because it's easily cultured and it's used as a biocontrol agent. But the larvae of the wasps anesthetize the caterpillar. They produce an anesthetic, so it doesn't so presumably it doesn't feel these things bursting out of its skin, so the caterpillar doesn't attack them. They also disrupt the caterpillar's nervous system with a cytokine storm. So the caterpillar is just totally, basically doesn't want to eat anymore, and it behaves really oddly. And this is the effect of some of that. This is my friend James filmed this. Oh, James added the music. He was obviously appalled by this biology. The caterpillar sits over the cocoons of the wasp, and it defends them. So there you go. It's doomed, and then it spends the remaining few days of its life protecting these cocoons. And it even lays down extra silk to further protect the cocoons of the wasps that have just eaten its insides. So on that note, I think I should probably finish.